At the Jury Room Bar in Santa Cruz, the local police had a favorite regular. He was a 6'9" giant named Big Ed. Polite, intelligent, and always buying rounds for the officers. They shared drinks, laughs, and even frustration over the terrifying string of co-ed murders plaguing the coast. The cops felt safe with him. The young hitchhikers he picked up along the highways felt safe with him too. But Big Ed wasn't just a friendly giant. He was Edmund Kemper, and while the police were hunting a ghost, the monster was sitting on the bar stool right next to them. Burbank, California, in the post-war era, was the glossy Technicolor advertisement for the American dream. It was a sanctuary of manicured lawns, two-car garages, and the unwavering belief that everything was going to be all right. But behind the pastel curtains of one modest home, a very different reality was taking shape. On December 18, 1948, Clarnell Kemper gave birth to her only son, Edmund Emil Kemper III. From the moment he entered the world, Ed was an anomaly. He weighed in at a staggering 13 pounds, nearly 6 kilograms. He wasn't just a newborn. He was a giant. In a society that preached conformity, Ed was physically incapable of blending in. He was born taking up too much space, a disruption to the order his mother so desperately craved. His father, Edmund Jr., was a World War II veteran who had returned from the Pacific Theater to test atomic weapons. He was the quintessential man of his time, stoic, distant, a provider of paychecks, but a hoarder of affection. He was a ghost in his own house. Clarnell, however, was a storm. She was a woman vibrating with neurotic energy and deep-seated dissatisfaction. The air in the Kemper household was thick with tension, a silent war of attrition between a passive father and a domineering mother. Caught in the crossfire was young Ed, a sensitive boy who just kept growing. By the time he was a teenager, the physical disparity was terrifying. At 15, he stood 6'4" and weighed over 200 pounds. He towered over his teachers, his father, and the other boys in the neighborhood. He was a man-mountain with the emotional maturity of a wounded child. While other boys were joining Little League or riding bicycles, Ed was drifting into a dark, internal world. The suburban normality of Burbank became the backdrop for his macabre rehearsals. He engaged in rituals that disturbed anyone who looked closely enough. He would convince his sisters to play a game called Gas Chamber, where he would writhe on the floor, mimicking the agonizing death throes of an executed prisoner. He would play dead for hours, staring unblinkingly at the ceiling, waiting for someone to notice, for someone to care. It was a grotesque theater of one, a silent scream for attention in a house where he was treated like a piece of furniture that was too big for the room. The neighbors saw a polite, albeit awkward giant. They didn't see the rot beneath the surface. They didn't see a boy who was systematically dissecting the world around him, looking for the mechanics of death. The collapse of the family unit was the final straw. When his parents divorced, the buffer was removed. His father fled, leaving Ed alone with the primary source of his pain. He was abandoned by the man he wanted to be, and left in the clutches of the woman who wished he had never been born. The suburban nightmare wasn't just a phrase. For Edmund Kemper, it was his daily existence. He was a boy trapped in a man's body, living in a house that was slowly suffocating him, waiting for the pressure to blow the roof off. If the broken home in Burbank was the foundation of the monster, then Clarnell Kemper was the architect who drafted the blueprints. To understand the violence that would later terrorize California, you cannot look away from the relationship between Ed and his mother. It was a bond forged in hell. After the divorce, Clarnell moved the family to Montana, dragging Ed into a desolate isolation that mirrored his internal state. It was here, stripped of the distractions of the city, that Clarnell's abuse evolved from general neglect to focused surgical malice. Clarnell was an alcoholic, a woman who drank to numb her own failures and then unleashed her venom on her son. She looked at Ed, and she didn't see a child. She saw a caricature of his father. She saw the man she hated, magnified to a terrifying size. She weaponized his own body against him. She constantly told him he was ugly, that he was a weirdo, that no decent woman would ever want him. She didn't just insult him. She tried to socially sterilize him. She feared that his sheer size made him a predator by default. In a twisted projection of her own anxieties, she became convinced that Ed would harm his younger sisters. To prevent this imagined crime, she created a prison within their own home. While his sisters slept in warm beds upstairs, Clarnell banished Ed to the basement. He was forced to sleep on a cot next to the furnace, surrounded by darkness and the smell of mildew. It was a literal and metaphorical descent. He was the creature under the floorboards, the shameful secret that had to be caged. This wasn't just punishment, it was conditioning. By treating him like a dangerous animal, she was teaching him that he was one. She was validating the dark impulses he was beginning to feel. But the abuse wasn't just physical separation, it was psychological castration. Clarnell was terrified of Ed's sexuality. She mocked him for not having a girlfriend, accusing him of being gay, a severe stigma in the conservative 1950s. Yet she simultaneously forbade him from dating, claiming he would only ruin a girl. It was a double bind designed to drive him insane. She needed him to be the failure she predicted. Ed loved his mother with the desperate, pathetic love of a child, but he also hated her with a murderous intensity. Every night spent in that cold basement, listening to her drunken footsteps above him, solidified a singular truth in his mind. Women were powerful, cruel figures who held the keys to his worth, and the only way to get those keys back was to take them. Clarnell thought she was suppressing a monster, but in reality, she was feeding it, day by day, insult by insult. While Clarnell was busy destroying her son's ego in the basement, she was oblivious to the fact that Edmund was already building something new to replace it. In the world of criminal psychology, there is a concept known as the Macdonald Triad, a set of 3 behaviors that often predict a future of violent offending: bedwetting, pyromania, and cruelty to animals. By the time he was a teenager, Edmund Kemper wasn't just ticking these boxes. He was using them as a curriculum. The basement wasn't just a prison. It was a laboratory where he began to experiment with the power of life and death, seeking a control he could never find in the world above the floorboards. The family pets became the first casualties of his developing pathology. For most children, a pet is a source of comfort, a friend. For Ed, the family cats were practice dummies. In one particularly chilling incident that foreshadowed his future modus operandi, he took one of the family cats and buried it alive in the yard. But he didn't just walk away. He waited. He let the animal suffer, absorbing the reality of what he had done, before digging it up. When he retrieved the animal, he didn't save it. He decapitated it. He placed the head on a spike, a ritualistic display that suggests he wasn't just killing for the sake of killing. He was trying to understand the mechanics of fear and the permanence of death. He was 13 years old. To him, the cat wasn't a living creature. It was an object, a toy that could be broken to see how it worked. This fascination with death bled into his playtime with his sisters. They thought they were just playing games, but Ed was directing a horror movie. He invented a game called Electric Chair. He would have his sisters strap him into a chair, flipping a pretend switch, and then he would writhe and convulse in a terrifyingly realistic simulation of execution. At other times, he would play the gas chamber, mimicking the final desperate gasps of a dying man. While his sisters laughed, thinking it was just Big Brother Ed being weird again, Ed was actually rehearsing his own fantasy. He was obsessed with the idea of the lethal injection, the rope, the chair. He was fascinated by the moment a human being ceases to exist. But the most terrifying warning sign didn't happen in the backyard or the playroom. It happened at school. The rage that Clarnell was feeding him began to spill over onto other women who held authority over him. When he was just in the 2nd grade, Ed fell into a dark obsession with his teacher. She was a woman, an authority figure, a stand-in for the mother he couldn't destroy. He didn't bring her an apple. He brought a bayonet. He took a large knife from his father's collection and crept to school, hiding in the bushes, watching her. He later admitted that he was fantasizing about killing her, about exerting the ultimate power over a woman who represented the system that made him feel small. He was a child with the mind of a predator, holding a weapon of war, waiting for a chance to strike. The only reason he didn't act was fear, not morality. The wiring in his brain was already crossed. The warning signs were flashing neon red: the animal torture, the death rituals, the weaponized stalking. But in the naive landscape of 1950s America, nobody knew how to read the language of a budding serial killer. They just saw a troubled boy, unaware that he was graduating from killing cats to hunting humans. By 1964, the tension in the Kemper household had become unsustainable. Clarnell, perhaps sensing the danger radiating from her son, or simply tired of his presence, decided to ship him off. She sent the 15-year-old Ed to live with his paternal grandparents, Edmund Sr. and Maud Kemper, on their remote ranch in North Fork, California. If Clarnell thought this would fix him, she was dead wrong. North Fork was a desolate, rugged landscape in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, miles away from civilization. For a teenager already struggling with isolation, it was like being sent to the moon. And worse, he traded one tyrant for another. His grandmother, Maud Kemper, was a woman cut from the same cloth as Clarnell, only older and more bitter. She was strict, domineering, and constantly belittled Ed. She complained about his size, his appetite, and his laziness. She became the new focal point for all the hatred he had stored up against his mother. The ranch became a pressure cooker. Ed had grown to 6'4" and was physically imposing, yet he was still being treated like a naughty child. He had access to rifles, tools for farm life, which gave him a sense of power that Maud was constantly trying to strip away. The explosion happened on a scorching afternoon, August 27, 1964. The heat was oppressive, hanging over the ranch like a shroud. Ed was sitting at the kitchen table, and Maud was in a foul mood. She had been nagging him all day, and the argument escalated when she questioned his judgment, or perhaps his manhood. She declared that she was going to take his rifle away. That was the trigger. For Ed, the gun wasn't just a weapon. It was his agency. He watched her walk away, and something inside him simply snapped. Or perhaps it finally clicked into place. He didn't scream. He didn't throw a tantrum. He calmly picked up a .22 caliber rifle. As Maud sat in the living room writing entries in her diary, Ed walked up behind her. He raised the rifle, aimed at the back of her head, and pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot shattered the silence of the afternoon. Maud slumped forward, dead instantly. But the rage wasn't satisfied. He grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed her lifeless body repeatedly. A frenzy of overkill that released years of pent-up aggression against the matriarchs who had tormented him. Then, the cold logic of the psychopath took over. He realized his grandfather would be coming home from the grocery store soon. He went outside and waited by the driveway, the rifle resting in his hands. When Edmund Sr.'s car pulled up the long dirt road, Ed didn't run. He walked up to the vehicle. His grandfather looked at him, confused. Ed raised the rifle again and shot him. When asked later why he killed the grandfather he actually liked, Ed's response was chillingly practical. I didn't want him to have to see what I'd done to grandmother. I didn't want him to be sad. It was a twisted form of mercy, a justification that made perfect sense only to a mind completely detached from human empathy. With two bodies cooling on the property, Ed didn't flee into the mountains. He didn't panic. He walked back into the house and picked up the telephone. He called his mother first, who told him to call the police. So he did. He dialed the local sheriff and calmly stated, I just killed my grandmother and grandfather. He waited on the porch for the sirens to wind their way up the mountain roads. When the deputies arrived, they didn't find a monster foaming at the mouth. They found a polite, giant teenager who surrendered without a fight. He had crossed the line. The boy who played dead was gone. The killer had arrived. But as he was led away in handcuffs, nobody, not even the police, realized that for Edmund Kemper, this wasn't the end of the road. It was just the opening act. Sent to the maximum security psychiatric ward at Atascadero State Hospital, Edmund Kemper found himself in a place designed to contain monsters. Yet it was here, surrounded by the walls of the institution, that he discovered his most dangerous weapon was not a gun or a knife, but his own mind. When the heavy steel doors slammed shut behind him, the psychiatrists looked at the teenage boy who had slaughtered his grandparents and saw a paranoid schizophrenic, a diagnosis that suggested a break from reality, a chaotic mind that could perhaps be put back together with enough therapy and medication. What they failed to see was the terrifying clarity hiding behind his glasses. Kemper's intake evaluation revealed an IQ that hovered between 136 and 145, a score that placed him firmly in the genius range. While other inmates were medicated into a stupor or raging against their restraints, Kemper was observing. He quickly realized that Atascadero wasn't a prison in the traditional sense. It was a game, a maze of psychological evaluations and behavioral expectations. To get out, he didn't need to dig a tunnel. He just needed to convince the gatekeepers that he was sane. And for a genius sociopath, acting sane was simply a matter of learning the script. The tragedy of the American mental health system in the late 60s was its arrogance, the belief that it could cure evil with a few years of group therapy. Kemper exploited this hubris with surgical precision. He became the model patient. He was polite, articulate, and helpful. He didn't cause trouble. In fact, He became an asset to the staff. Because of his high intelligence and cooperative demeanor, the doctors did something that seems unthinkable in hindsight. They made him a trustee. They gave the fox the keys to the henhouse. Kemper was assigned to help administer the very psychological tests that were used to evaluate the inmate's progress. This was the ultimate systemic failure. Kemper wasn't just taking the tests. He was grading them. He had access to the answer keys. He learned exactly what a rehabilitated person was supposed to say. He studied the profiles of varied psychopathologies and learned how to mimic the responses of a well-adjusted, remorseful young man. He later bragged that he knew more about the tests than the doctors did. He was running circles around the professionals, feeding them the exact data they needed to justify their own success. They wanted to believe they had saved him, so he let them believe it. He became their trophy, the shining example of how the system worked, all while the darkness inside him was calcifying, untouched and unnoticed. By 1969, the doctors at Atascadero were convinced. They looked at the charts, the test scores, and the calm demeanor of Big Ed and declared him cured. They recommended his release. It was a decision that ignored the fundamental nature of his crime, the cold-blooded execution of his family, and focused instead on his performance in a controlled environment. The parole board, swayed by the glowing reports from the psychiatrists, granted his freedom. At 21 years old, the man who had murdered his grandparents to see what it felt like was unleashed back into society. The state of California didn't just release a killer. They had educated him. They had taught him how to blend in, how to manipulate authority, and how to hide the monster beneath a veneer of normalcy. He walked out of Atascadero not as a cured man, but as a master of camouflage, armed with the knowledge that he could fool the smartest people in the room. Upon his release in December 1969, the legal system made a decision that was almost poetic in its incompetence. They released Edmund Kemper into the custody of his mother. The court, in its infinite wisdom, sent the boy who killed his grandmother back to the woman who had created his hatred for women in the first place. He moved back to Clarnell's house in Aptos, a quiet coastal town near Santa Cruz. To the outside world, he was just a young man getting a fresh start. He was a hulking figure, standing 6'9" and weighing nearly 300 pounds, but he carried himself with a gentle, lumbering grace that disarmed everyone he met. He quickly set about building a facade of aggressive normalcy. He got a job with the California Department of Public Works, working on the highways. There is a chilling irony in this employment. The man who would soon turn the roadsides of California into his dumping grounds was paid by the state to maintain them. He was a good worker, reliable and strong. He used the settlement money from a motorcycle accident to buy a new car, a sensible 1969 Ford Galaxie 500. It was a standard American sedan, the kind of car a family man would drive. But for Kemper, it was an essential tool. It was a mobile kill room, spacious enough to hide a body, powerful enough to cruise the highways for hours. But the masterstroke of his disguise was his social life. Ed didn't hide in the shadows. He walked right into the light. He became a regular at the Jury Room, a popular bar in Santa Cruz, frequented by off-duty police officers. He was a cop buff, a young man fascinated by law enforcement. He befriended the officers, buying them rounds of beer, listening to their war stories, and talking shop. They loved him. They called him Big Ed, or Big E. To them, he was a harmless, friendly giant, A bit of a nuisance, perhaps, with his constant questions, but ultimately, a good guy. He was the guy you'd trust to watch your back in a bar fight. This relationship with the police was the ultimate cover. Kemper wasn't just hiding in plain sight. He was hiding in the lap of the enemy. He was gathering intelligence, learning how they investigated crimes, what they looked for, and where their blind spots were. Every beer he bought for a sheriff's deputy was an investment in his own immunity. While he laughed with them at the bar, discussing the hippie trash and the rising crime rates, his mind was working on a different frequency. He was testing the waters, seeing if anyone could see through the mask. Nobody did. They saw the size, the smile, the badge-worshipping enthusiasm. They didn't see the pressure building behind his eyes. Underneath this meticulously constructed persona of the friendly neighbor, the Macdonald Triad was vibrating with renewed intensity. The highways of Santa Cruz were teeming with young college women, hitchhiking from campus to the beach, thumbs out, trusting in the goodwill of strangers. It was the era of peace and love. And Big Ed in his Ford Galaxy looked like a safe ride. He began to patrol the roads, not yet killing, but rehearsing. He would pick up hitchhikers, drive them to their destinations, and let them go, engaging in a terrifying game of will I or won't I? He was testing his control, feeling the thrill of having a life in his hands. The friendly giant was preparing for his harvest, and the police officers drinking with him at the jury room had no idea that the man buying the next round was about to become the reason they wouldn't sleep for the next 3 years. The stage was set, the actor was ready, and the audience was completely looking the other way. By May of 1972, the rehearsals were over. The friendly giant, who had spent years studying the patterns of the highway and the protocols of the police, was finally ready to raise the curtain on his main act. The will I or won't I games were finished. On May 7th, the sun was shining over Berkeley, a campus that had become the epicenter of the American counterculture, a place symbolizing freedom and the future. But for Marianne Pesce and Anita Lucchesa, two 18-year-old roommates, that future was about to be violently erased. They were doing what thousands of students did every weekend, hitchhiking, looking for a ride to Stanford University. When the sensible Ford Galaxy pulled over and the polite, well-dressed giant behind the wheel offered them a lift, they didn't hesitate. They climbed in, unaware that they had just stepped into a mobile tomb. Kemper drove them to a secluded wooded area near Alameda. The mask of the good guy dropped instantly. He stabbed and strangled the young women, extinguishing 2 bright lives in a matter of minutes. But the horror of this crime isn't just in the act of murder itself. It lies in what happened immediately after. Most killers panic. They flee. They try to distance themselves from the evidence. Edmund Kemper did the opposite. He loaded the bodies of Pesce and Lucchesa into the trunk of his car and drove back toward Santa Cruz. On the way home, he made a stop. He pulled into the parking lot of the jury room, the very bar where he held court with his police friends. With the bodies of 2 missing college students decomposing in his trunk just yards away, Kemper walked inside, ordered a beer, and chatted with the off-duty officers. He laughed at their jokes, listened to their complaints about the hippie crime wave, and played the role of the sympathetic ear. It was a moment of supreme sickening irony. The hunters were buying drinks for the predator, completely oblivious to the fact that the evidence they would spend months searching for was parked right outside the front door. This wasn't just arrogance. It was a power trip of the highest order. Kemper was proving to himself that he was smarter, colder, and more capable than the entire system designed to catch him. He eventually drove the bodies back to his apartment, the home he shared with his mother. In the dead of night, while Clarnell slept just a few rooms away, Kemper dissected the remains. He engaged in acts of necrophilia, violating the women in death in a way he could never interact with them in life. He then took the remains to a remote location, known ironically as the Garden of Eden, and scattered them. The police found a skull weeks later, but they had no leads. The co-ed killer was born, but the panic was just beginning. In September, the hunger returned. Aiko Ku was only 15 years old, a young girl with her whole life ahead of her. She made the mistake of accepting a ride from Big Ed. Kemper drove her to the mountains, but this time, the ritual was even more prolonged. He didn't kill her immediately. He talked to her. He waited. He later described a chilling moment where he simply sat there, his hand on her, waiting for the terror to set in, waiting to take absolute possession of her existence. When he finally strangled her, the violence didn't end with her last breath. He took her body back to his apartment, continuing his grotesque exploration of the dead. He was treating these women not as humans, but as dolls, objects that couldn't reject him, couldn't mock him, and couldn't leave him. By the end of 1972, a shadow had fallen over the university campuses of California. The carefree spirit of the hitchhiking era was being strangled. Parents were terrified to send their daughters to school. Female students began organizing buddy systems, carrying whistles, and looking at every passing car with suspicion. The co-ed killer was the boogeyman in the headlines, a phantom who seemed to strike at will and vanish without a trace. The police were desperate, chasing down leads on known sex offenders and suspicious drifters, never once looking at the polite man who worked for the highway department and drove a car that looked exactly like an unmarked police cruiser. The terror was palpable, but the public didn't know the worst part. The killer wasn't killing these girls because he hated them. He was killing them because they were stand-ins. Every time he choked the life out of a co-ed, he was fantasizing about the woman waiting for him at home. As 1973 dawned, the facade of Edmund Kemper began to crack, not on the outside, but on the inside. The proxy murders were losing their potency. Killing the co-eds, these symbols of the young, independent women his mother despised yet envied, was supposed to satisfy the rage. But it was like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. The hatred for Clarnell was a black hole that consumed everything. In January, he picked up Cindy Shaw, another student. The pattern was familiar: the ride, the weapon, the death. But the disposal of Cindy Shaw marked a shift into a level of psychological symbolism that is almost too dark to comprehend. After dismembering her body in the apartment, again while his mother was present in the house, Kemper took a specific part of her remains and made a statement that was meant for an audience of one. He took Cindy Shaw's severed head and buried it in the garden of his mother's house. But he didn't just bury it randomly. He positioned the face to look directly up at Clarnell's bedroom window. In a twisted private joke that he would later recount to psychiatrists with a chuckle, he stated that his mother always wanted people to look up to her. This wasn't just body disposal, it was a ritualistic curse. Every morning, Clarnell would wake up, look out her window at her well-tended garden, and have no idea that she was staring into the eyes of her son's victim. It was Kemper's way of asserting dominance over the woman who had controlled every aspect of his life. He had turned her sanctuary into a graveyard, and she was none the wiser. It gave him a sense of godlike control. He was polluting her world with his violence, integrating his crimes into the very domestic fabric she tried to maintain. However, the thrill of the secret was fading. The compulsion was accelerating. In February, he grew bolder. He didn't wait for hitchhikers on the highway. He went to the source. He drove onto the campus of the University of California, Santa Cruz, the very heart of the student population. He picked up Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu. These were two friends, safe in their own environment, who trusted the man with the friendly smile and the Department of Public Works sticker on his car. This time, the method changed. He used a .22 caliber pistol. The intimacy of strangulation was replaced by the efficiency of execution. The bodies of Thorpe and Liu were found later, and the panic in California reached a fever pitch. The co-ed killer was now hunting in pairs, striking on campus grounds. The press was in a frenzy. The police were under immense pressure to find the monster. Yet, Kemper remained invisible. He passed through police checkpoints. He waved at officers he knew. He was so ordinary, so helpful, so American in his appearance, that he deflected all suspicion. But internally, the pressure was mounting. The message to mother in the garden hadn't been enough. The killings of the 6 college women were horrific tragedies. But in Kemper's mind, they were just appetizers. They were the warm-up act for the finale he had been planning since he was a boy locked in the basement. The ghosts of the co-eds were screaming for justice, but Kemper knew that the only way to silence the noise in his head was to stop killing the substitutes and finally confront the source. The time for games was over. The giant was going home. By the spring of 1973, the psychological dam that Edmund Kemper had painstakingly constructed to hold back his hatred was beginning to fracture under the immense pressure of his double life. He had killed 6 young women, desecrated their bodies, and terrorized the entire state of California. Yet the one person he truly wanted to kill, the source of all his rage, was still sleeping down the hall. The co-ed murders, as horrific as they were, had merely been proxies, violent rehearsals for the main event that had been inevitable since the day Clarnell locked him in the basement as a child. The tension in the Aptos house was palpable, a suffocating fog that filled every room. Clarnell had come home late from a party on Friday night, April 20th, drunk and belligerent. She had spent the last 24 hours doing what she did best, belittling her son, questioning his worth, mocking his lack of ambition, and reminding him that he was nothing more than a burden to her. But this time, Big Ed didn't retreat to his room to sulk or drive into the night to find a victim. He waited. As the clock ticked past 5 a.m. on Easter weekend, a time usually reserved for family gatherings and spiritual renewal, Edmund Kemper made the decision that would define his legacy. He picked up a heavy claw hammer. He walked quietly down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under his massive frame, and entered his mother's bedroom. Clarnell was asleep, completely unaware that the giant she had tormented for years was standing over her, silhouetted by the early morning light. There were no final words, no dramatic confrontation, no screaming argument. Kemper swung the hammer with a force that shattered more than just bone. It shattered the matriarchal control that had defined his existence. He struck her in the head, killing her instantly. The woman who had been the architect of his misery was dead. But for Kemper, death was never the end. It was just a change of state. The rage that fueled him required more than just murder. It required total obliteration and a symbolic silencing of the voice that had haunted him. In a sequence of events that stands as one of the most grotesque in criminal history, he decapitated his mother. But he didn't stop there. He was consumed by a frantic need to silence the voice that had nagged, mocked, and humiliated him for his entire life. He cut out her vocal cords. In a moment of madness that he would later recount with chilling objectivity, he attempted to put the vocal cords down the garbage disposal in the kitchen sink. However, the machine clogged and spewed the remains back up. Even in death, Clarnell refused to be silenced. Kemper, standing in the kitchen covered in his mother's blood, actually shouted at the sink, furious that she was still fighting him, still resisting his control. It was a scene of domestic horror that transcended simple violence and entered the realm of the surreal. Having finally destroyed his primary tormentor, the adrenaline was still pumping, but the plan wasn't finished. Kemper needed to buy time, or perhaps he simply wanted to widen the circle of destruction to include those who had enabled his mother's behavior. He cleaned himself up and made a phone call. He called Sally Hallett, one of Clarnell's best friends, and invited her over for a surprise dinner. It was a trap set with the cold calculation of a spider. When Sally arrived at the house later that evening, she walked into a tomb. Kemper, playing the role of the dutiful son one last time, let her in. The house was quiet. Too quiet. When she asked where Clarnell was, Kemper didn't answer with words. He answered with violence. He strangled Sally Hallett, leaving her body on the bed, posing her as if she were waiting for her friend to return. He now had two bodies in the house. The co-ed killer had come full circle. He had killed the mother, and he had killed the mother's friend, the audience to her life. He spent the next day in the house with the corpses, watching television, drinking beer, and waiting for the reality of what he had done to settle in. But strangely, the rage was gone. The pressure in his head, the buzzing that he had described to psychiatrists as a constant companion, had finally stopped. The mission was accomplished. There were no more proxies needed, no more rehearsals. The show was over. He decapitated Sally Hallett as well, placing the heads of the two women on the mantelpiece, staring at them, finally feeling the godlike control he had craved since boyhood. He packed his car, the faithful Ford Galaxy, with guns, ammunition, and a portable radio, and drove away from the house in Aptos, leaving the carnage behind for the police to find. The American matriarch had fallen, and her son was hitting the road, not as a fugitive running from fear, but as a man who had finally finished his checklist. Edmund Kemper drove east, putting the California coastline in his rearview mirror. He drove through the deserts of Nevada, the salt flats of Utah, and into the wide-open plains of Colorado. He listened to the radio constantly, scanning the frequencies, waiting for the breaking news. He waited for the bulletin that would announce the discovery of the bodies in Aptos, the manhunt for the monster, the recognition of his work. But the radio remained silent. The police hadn't found the bodies. Nobody knew what he had done. For a narcissist like Kemper, this silence was the ultimate insult. He had committed the crime of the century. He had slaughtered the co-ed killer's final victims, and nobody was paying attention. He realized that if he wanted the credit, if he wanted the world to know who he really was, he would have to tell them himself. In Pueblo, Colorado, the giant pulled his car over to a phone booth on the side of the road. He dialed the local police. When the officer on the other end picked up, Kemper confessed. He told them he was the co-ed killer. He told them he had murdered his mother and her friend. At first, the police didn't believe him. They thought it was a prank call from a drunk or a lunatic seeking attention. Kemper, frustrated by their skepticism, had to plead with them to arrest him. He provided details that only the killer could know. He even waited by the phone booth for them to arrive, his car parked in plain sight. When the patrol cars finally pulled up, he didn't resist. He handed over his guns and surrendered. It was the most anticlimactic end to a killing spree imaginable. He wasn't caught by a dragnet or a brilliant detective. He turned himself in because his ego couldn't handle the anonymity. The trial was a formality. Kemper requested the death penalty, stating clearly to the court that he deserved to die by torture for what he had done. He wanted to be erased. However, due to the legal climate of the time, the death penalty had been briefly suspended in California following the Furman versus Georgia decision. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was sent to the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, where Big Ed began his second life. Inside the walls, he wasn't the beast the media portrayed. He became the model prisoner. He was polite, intelligent, and helpful. He ran the prison ceramic shop, managing other inmates. He even spent thousands of hours recording audiobooks for the blind. In a twist of dark irony, the voice that had silenced Clarnell became a comforting narrator for the sightless, recording hundreds of titles, including, famously, the novelization of Star Wars. But his true legacy, the reason we still talk about him today, lies in his unique contribution to law enforcement. In the late 1970s, FBI agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler were pioneering a new method of criminal profiling. They wanted to understand how serial killers thought, how they hunted, and why they did what they did. They went to Vacaville to interview Kemper. Unlike other killers who were evasive, delusional, or incoherent, Kemper was open, analytical, and terrifyingly self-aware. He treated the interviews like a graduate seminar. He explained his methods, his fantasies, his trolling techniques, and the psychology behind his selection of victims. Kemper gave the FBI the blueprint of the organized killer. He explained how he used his nice guy persona to disarm victims, how he used his police connections to stay ahead of the investigation, and how he compartmentalized his life. His insights became the cornerstone of the Behavioral Science Unit, BSU. Much of what we know today about hunting serial killers comes from the mind of the man who hunted co-eds. He remains in prison to this day, a towering, aging figure who successfully manipulated the world into fearing him, then charmed the experts into studying him. He is the ultimate paradox of the American crime story. The monster who became the teacher, sitting in his cell, analyzing his own darkness for the benefit of those trying to catch the next one. Today, the shadow that once stretched across the California coast has shrunk to the size of a wheelchair. Edmund Kemper, the 6'9" giant who terrorized a generation, is now a frail old man confined to the California Medical Facility. As of 2024, his requests for parole have been repeatedly denied, and in recent years, he has stopped attending the hearings altogether. He knows the outcome. The system that once tragically released him has finally locked the door for good. But as he sits in silence, waiting for the end, Kemper remains a terrifying mirror. He forces us to ask uncomfortable questions, not just about the nature of evil, but about the nurture of it. Was he born a monster, or was he forged in that basement in Burbank by a mother who refused to love him? He is a living reminder that the most dangerous predators don't always look like beasts. Sometimes they look like the polite neighbor who offers you a ride home. Thank you for walking this dark road with me. If this story chilled you, if it made you look at the world a little differently, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We have many more stories to tell, and the archives are full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, goodbye.